Hidden beneath the dense hills of Zhejiang province lies a place that shouldn't exist. In 1992, an ordinary farmer accidentally discovered underground chambers as tall as a 5-story building, carved into the rock with impossible precision. Thus began the story of the Longyou caves, a mystery that continues to challenge the entire archaeology of the world. A chance find that changed history. In early summer of 1992, a Chinese farmer named Xian Yao had a simple project in mind: cleaning a small pond near his home in the village of Xianbei. He planned to deepen the bottom to raise fish, so he and his son began pumping out the murky water. When the water had reached half its depth, a stone clanged beneath his shovels. Not loose limestone, but a smooth granite slab, so perfectly shaped and smooth that the farmer stopped in disbelief. He touched it with his hand and felt a chill, as if emanating not from the earth, but from the depths. Curiosity got the better of them. The neighbors helped pump out the remaining water, and soon a hole appeared beneath the pond. When one of the men shone a flashlight into it, the beam plunged downward, disappearing into the darkness like a shaft. There was no moisture, no trace of a natural cavity. Instead, smooth walls, as if polished by a tool. They dropped a stone into the hole, and it fell slowly, hitting somewhere far below. Then the men realized something much more than just a cave lay hidden beneath their village. A few days later, county authorities dispatched a team of geologists to the site. They were supposed to check for karst voids, but instead of a natural formation, the experts saw perfectly carved steps descending into a hall nearly 30 meters high. The walls were lined with parallel stripes running from floor to ceiling, like chisel marks. The floors were smooth, the corners precise, the vaults crack-free, and every surface seemed machine-finished. At the bottom, there was a silence uncharacteristic of underground cavities. The sound of footsteps reverberated evenly, without echo. Having widened the passage, the researchers soon discovered that the first hall was only part of a vast network. Beyond it were corridors leading to adjacent rooms, some with ceilings over 10 meters high, others with columns receding into darkness. Lanterns illuminated only a small portion of the space, and even experienced engineers standing beneath the vaults could not understand how ancient people could have carved such a structure from solid rock without modern technology. Archaeologists from Hangzhou arrived a week later. They expected to find the remains of a mine shaft or an ancient temple, but initial measurements revealed the impossible. The walls were perfectly angled, perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. The cut marks were uniform in depth and pitch, as if they had been made by a machine with constant force. There was not the slightest trace of soot on the ceilings, even though only oil lamps were used to illuminate such spaces in ancient times. When they began pumping water from the nearby ponds, new caves opened up underground. By autumn, there were 24 of them, each with its own unique layout: halls, columns, bridges, pools, even stone pedestals, seemingly designed for statues. But the main mystery lay not in their scale, but in the silence of history. Not a single ancient text, not a single dynastic chronicle mentioned anything like this. For millennia, the Chinese recorded everything: the construction of temples, the digging of wells, military campaigns, even unusual natural phenomena. But not a word was said about the Longyou caves. Scientists hypothesized that the complex may have been built during the Qin dynasty, approximately 2,000 years ago, but no pottery, tools, or human remains were found. Not even embers from fires were found. Longyou was completely empty. Geologists collected rock samples, basalt and sandstone, the density of which required colossal effort to cut. Manually carving just one cave would have required decades and hundreds of workers, but no traces of human activity were found. With each passing day, the mystery deepened. If the complex was built by humans, why did they abandon it, leaving no inscriptions or symbols? Why were the halls perfectly preserved, without collapse, despite the millennia? And if not humans, then who, and by what means, created an underground city covering tens of thousands of square meters? Today, that very first cave, discovered beneath the farmer's yard, is open to tourists. Spotlights glide across its walls, illuminating patterns that remain unexplained. A glass dome stands where the pond once stood, and beneath it begins a descent into silence, where every step is a reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries happen by chance. Yet, they can change our understanding of human history. a labyrinth that is not in the chronicles. When the first cave was officially recognized as an archaeological discovery, the provincial government dispatched an entire expedition of geologists, engineers, and historians to the site. At first, everyone thought it was a single underground chamber, perhaps an ancient reservoir or a secret refuge from the times of ancient dynasties. But once they began exploring the neighboring areas, it became clear a whole labyrinth lay hidden underground, a gigantic network of chambers extending tens of meters deep. Beyond the first chamber, a gallery opened, then another and another, until the number of caves exceeded 20. Later, using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered that they were all connected by a complex system of corridors and staircases, forming a kind of underground city with an area of up to 30,000 square meters. Each cave had its own layout, but all were built according to a common principle: enormous halls with ceilings up to 30 meters high, massive columns, arches, bridges, passages, and artificial pools. The walls were polished to a mirror shine and covered with strange parallel stripes running from floor to ceiling. Instruments showed that all angles were maintained to within 1 degree, and level deviations did not exceed a couple of centimeters. What was considered impossible for ancient builders was realized here with mathematical perfection. However, the more evidence the researchers collected, the more perplexed they became. The team's lead archaeologist, Professor Li Ming, was the first to note the complete absence of mentions of such structures in Chinese chronicles. China is a country where each dynasty left behind tens of thousands of pages of chronicles, and where literally everything was documented: earthquakes, construction, even festivals in small villages. But not a single line about Longyou. Not the slightest hint was found in the chronicles of the Qin Empire, nor in the records of the Han dynasties, nor even in the regional chronicles of Zhejiang. Scholars turned to archives, hoping to find at least a mention of large stoneworks in this region. But even the ancient poems describing the wonders of the Celestial Empire contained nothing resembling underground palaces. Li Ming wrote in his report that such silence contradicted all Chinese tradition, as the construction of such a complex would have required decades and thousands of workers. The empire could not have left such a monumental undertaking undocumented, especially if it served state purposes. When they began to study the interior architecture, even more mysteries emerged. The corridors didn't simply lead from one hall to another, but formed a complex structure with the symmetry characteristic of religious buildings. However, there were no statues, no sacrificial niches, no altars. Some caves resembled gigantic storage rooms with niches around the perimeter. Others were enormous acoustic halls where the sound of a voice turned into a soft echo, as if the wall absorbed excess vibrations. One of the engineers noticed that proportions were repeated in different caves. The walls were the same thickness, the distances between columns were identical, and the ornamentation on the walls everywhere had the same rhythm. This meant that all the halls were built according to a single plan, as if they were overseen by a single architect or an entire team under precise control. But who could have possessed such knowledge thousands of years ago? When geologists analyzed the rock, they confirmed that the caves were carved out of solid sandstone. Carving just one of them by hand would have required at least 100,000 man-days. Even with round-the-clock labor and constant lighting, construction would have taken decades. But no traces of human activity were found. No tools, no pottery shards, not even the remains of fires. In some places, only a thin layer of sediment was found, indicating that the chambers had remained dry for many centuries. The most bizarre discovery awaited the archaeologists at the end of the first season. At a depth of 15 meters, they found a corridor leading to a chamber containing an artificial lake. The water was crystal clear, with no signs of stagnation, and maintained a constant level, as if fed by an underground system. Next to the pool were perfectly carved ledges, reminiscent of the steps of an amphitheater. But why were they here, underground? For gatherings, for rituals, or for something beyond the scope of modern logic? When the excavation results were presented at a conference in Hangzhou, Longyou was hailed as East Asia's most enigmatic archaeological site. Newspapers described it as China's underground Atlantis, and tourists flocked from across the country. However, the government ordered a halt to mass excavations and restricted access. The reason was simple. No one understood how robust these structures were and whether tampering with them would threaten their integrity. Later, in their reports, scientists wrote that the complex was built using principles reminiscent of modern urban planning, a unified design, a uniform style, and a sophisticated drainage and ventilation system. All of this speaks to a high level of engineering expertise that, according to official chronology, could not have existed in China at that time. But when it came to the date of construction, opinions differed. Some insisted on the 3rd century BC, while others suggested the caves may be older, perhaps thousands of years older. Thus, Longyou became one of the strangest archaeological phenomena, a labyrinth that doesn't exist in any historical source. It's as if someone once carved this city out of stone, completed the work, and forever erased their name from the world's memory. Every hall, every wall, every chisel mark today reminds us that Earth's history may be far deeper than we're accustomed to believing, and that sometimes even stone preserves the memory of civilizations we no longer remember. Geometry that defies chance. When the first measurements of the complex were completed, archaeologists realized they were looking at more than just a group of caves, but a system constructed with astonishing precision. Every wall, every column, every vault seemed to obey a strict architectural design, leaving no room for chance. Geometers from Peking University, brought in for the study, conducted laser scanning of the halls and obtained data that seemed impossible for antiquity. The wall angles were no more than 1 degree, and the height differences between halls were no more than 5 centimeters. All the rooms were oriented to the cardinal directions, as if someone had used a modern compass or geodetic surveying instruments. But what was most striking was the repeatability of proportions. Regardless of the cave's size, its height always corresponded to its length and width in the same ratio. Such unity was unknown even in the architecture of the dynasties where imperial palaces were built. In Longyou, one could sense the presence of an engineer who understood the harmony of form and space. Some researchers have suggested that the caves may have been created as a single structure, designed for a specific sound or lighting effect. And indeed, when the engineers turned on the spotlights in the hall, the beams reflected off the walls at the same angle, creating a soft, diffused glow, as if the entire space had been designed with optical engineering in mind. The interior surfaces resembled a gigantic pattern, composed of thousands of parallel stripes. These stripes, several millimeters deep, stretched continuously from floor to ceiling, uninterrupted even in the corners. Their direction was always consistent, regardless of the size of the hall. Geologists who studied stone samples claimed that such marks could only have been made by a tool moving with constant force and speed, something impossible to achieve by hand. However, no metal tools capable of leaving such marks have been found. Iron was rare at the time the complex was supposedly built, and bronze tools would not have been able to withstand such a force. Some architects put forward a bold idea. Perhaps the walls were finished using water, sand, and friction, similar to grinding. But calculations showed that leveling even a single hall using this method would have required centuries of continuous work. Researchers then began to consider the possibility that the caves might have been carved not from raw rock, but at a time when the stone was softened, for example, after a powerful geothermal event. This hypothesis seemed far-fetched, but it explained why the cut lines appeared not hollowed out, but rather elongated from within, like traces of melting. Another peculiarity is the acoustics. When scientists first turned on microphones and recorded sound in different chambers, they discovered that each had its own resonance. In some caves, the sound was amplified, creating a cathedral-like effect. In others, on the contrary, it disappeared, as if the walls were absorbing the waves. Moreover, the resonance frequencies coincided with harmonic numbers associated with the ancient Chinese musical system. The question arose, was this a coincidence, or were the caves designed with acoustics in mind, like a giant instrument designed to produce a specific sound? There were no cracks in the walls or ceilings, although the stone in places yielded to the intense pressure of the rocks. This indicated that physics and load distribution were taken into account during construction. Some sections of the ceilings are supported by massive columns, but most of the halls remain unobstructed, as if a load-bearing structure had been pre-calculated within the stone. Modern engineers, having studied the photographs, recognize that such forms are reminiscent of the wireframe modeling used today in the design of underground structures. However, the ancient builders could not have possessed such knowledge. When archaeologists from Peking University compared the dimensions of the caves, they discovered a pattern. Each was built according to the golden ratio. This ratio was used by architects in ancient Egypt and Greece to achieve harmonious forms. But there were no similar examples in China, at least none recorded. This led some researchers to speculate that the creators of the Longyou caves may have possessed knowledge from outside, from a civilization unknown to history. One of the engineers involved in the study said, "The experience inside the caves was like being inside a gigantic machine, where every component obeys precise laws of symmetry. Indeed, the deeper the measurements went, the more obvious it became. These chambers couldn't have been random. Their shape, proportions, and layout pointed to a purpose no one had yet understood. Perhaps the caves served as storage facilities, perhaps an observatory, or an underground temple where light, sound, and space were combined into a single system." But the main discovery was made when surveyors superimposed the cave plans on top of each other and discovered that their contours formed a pattern reminiscent of the ancient Chinese character for water. Water is indeed present in several chambers and has always been considered a symbol of life and purification. This coincidence gave rise to a new theory. Longyou may have been neither a city nor a warehouse, but a colossal sacred complex, created for communion with nature or even with something beyond it. Since then, the geometry of Longyou has become not just a subject of research, but a philosophical enigma. Who could have calculated these perfect proportions without mathematics, carved millions of cubic meters of stone without iron, or built an entire underground world without light? Every line in these caves is like the imprint of someone's knowledge, far older than anything we know about the civilizations of the East. And perhaps this is why Longyou remains for science what Atlantis was for sailors, proof that beyond the known stories, there is always another one we are not yet ready to hear. Stone waves and the mystery of strokes. When researchers began systematically studying the interior walls of the Longyou caves, everyone's attention was drawn to the identical patterns covering every surface, from floor to ceiling. These wave-like lines stretched endlessly, unbroken by curves or corners. They created the impression that the entire stone mass had been carved by a single tool, moving with the same speed and force. At first glance, these marks might have seemed decorative, but the more the experts examined them, the clearer it became. They were not simply ornamentation, but something far more complex, perhaps a technological imprint. Under a microscope, the stripes revealed parallel grooves about 3 millimeters deep, running with extreme regularity. The distance between them remained constant, just under a centimeter. Geologists immediately noted that achieving such a rhythm by hand is impossible, as any brushstroke, any force, creates microscopic glitches. But here, there were none. Even where the surface curved, the lines continued perfectly, as if the tool could change direction without losing its uniformity. Archaeologist Li Ming wrote in his report that the walls gave the impression of machine polishing, but machine polishing was simply impossible in the Qin dynasty. Other experts attempted a traditional explanation for the phenomenon, suggesting that the marks were left by primitive chisels. However, impact work always produces microscopic chips and irregularities, whereas here the surface remained smooth, as if the chisel had glided rather than struck. In one of the caves, number 5, a section of the wall was discovered where the grooves unexpectedly changed direction at a 90-degree angle, as if someone had deliberately delineated the boundaries of zones. It looked as if the interior space was divided into energetic or functional sectors. Some Chinese researchers even suggested that the lines could have served as a unique conductor of sound or light. When engineers aimed a laser beam at them, the reflection was unusual. The wavy structure of the stone dispersed the light so evenly that the space was filled with a soft glow without harsh shadows. This feature gave rise to a new theory. Perhaps the Longyou grottos were created with acoustic or optical symmetry in mind. Indeed, when archaeologists experimented with voices in these halls, the sound was neither muffled nor echoed. It seemed to dissolve into the stone, losing excess vibrations. Some experts argued that it was the relief of the walls that allowed sound waves to propagate evenly, creating ideal acoustics. This property is still used in concert halls and studios, but here it was realized thousands of years ago. Observing these patterns, tourists often compare them to water waves. In some places, the lines actually resemble the movement of currents, leading to a popular legend that the builders of Longyou were attempting to capture the breath of the ocean, a symbol of eternal movement and balance. However, if we look at the caves as engineering structures, these waves can be perceived as traces of systematic carving, careful, controlled, as if man were manipulating not a tool, but the rock itself. Chinese archaeologists conducted an experiment. They took sandstone samples from the same deposit and attempted to reproduce the patterns using traditional methods: stone and bronze chisels, abrasive powders, even rotating grinding stones. The result was merciless. No method produced a consistent rhythm. The lines were jagged and the surface was rough. This suggests that the builders possessed a technology that we have lost. Some engineers from Shanghai have proposed the idea of an ancient tool that operated on the principle of vibration, perhaps a primitive resonator that used vibrations to loosen rock. Such hypotheses seem fanciful, but they explain why there are no marks of impact in the caves, no potholes, and why the stone structure itself appears elongated. Perhaps this is why the walls haven't cracked over the centuries. Vibrational cutting doesn't destroy the rock's crystalline lattice. But beyond the technical theories, there was also a mystical one. Locals believed the lines on the walls were an ancient code written in stone. When viewed by torchlight, the patterns began to shimmer, creating optical illusions as if the surface were moving. Elders said these waves were the breath of the earth, a message from the ancestors, imprinted for those who dared to descend. Some researchers noticed that in several caves, the direction of the furrows formed a spiral converging toward the center of the ceiling, a symbol often found in Neolithic culture and signifying the connection between heaven and earth. Modern archaeologists still disagree. Some consider the lines purely decorative, others evidence of a technological process, and still others a system of symbols, possibly ritualistic. But the longer one looks at them, the stronger the feeling that these stripes conceal a meaning that defies translation into the language of modern science. The Longyou stone waves remain a silent text, written on material that has survived all eras. And perhaps someday someone will be able to read this text, not with their eyes, but with their feelings, the way the ancient masters understood the harmony of the world. After all, if you listen closely to these walls, it seems as if a distant rhythm still resounds beneath them, even and eternal, like the beating of the Earth's heart. The missing builders. When archaeologists completed the first stages of excavation and examined all 24 caves, they were confronted with a new, far more disturbing mystery. Everything they found pointed to the labor, complex calculations, and engineering ingenuity involved. But the strangest thing wasn't the sheer scale of the structure, but what it lacked. The Longyou caves were completely empty. No trace of human presence was found. No bones, no charcoal, no tool remains, no pottery, not even the dust typical of once inhabited places. It was as if the builders simply vanished the day they finished, leaving behind nothing but stone. The archaeologists expected to see at least traces of everyday life: footprints, torch marks, food remains, or debris. Because any human construction, especially one of such a large scale, always leaves behind noise, chaos, and disorder. But below ground, perfect order reigned. Even the layers of sediment indicated that the halls had not been used since the excavation was completed. There were no traces of moisture or soot on the walls, and no traces of burials or sacrificial rites on the floor. It was as if the builders were mere shadows, present but not existing. When the expedition attempted to determine the age of the complex, radiocarbon dating yielded no results. No organic material was found. There was simply nothing to date in the caves. Geologists then turned to rock erosion and water deposits to calculate at least a rough chronology. The results were vague. The age could range from 2,000 to 3,000 years, or even more. But even if we accept the minimum figure, an insoluble question remains. Who possessed such knowledge and rock-cutting techniques in that era? Chinese chronicles are silent, but folk legends have preserved hints. Elders from neighboring villages told archaeologists of ancient people of light, who supposedly lived underground and emerged only at night. They left no traces because they were not quite human. These stories were long considered village folktales, but they corresponded to reality. Longyou seemed to have been built not for habitation, but for the presence of something elusive, silent, and temporary. Some scholars suggested that the caves may have been part of a mining or storage system, perhaps an ancient water reservoir or grain warehouse. However, any such theory collapsed upon closer inspection. The chambers were too complex and decorative for water storage. They were too deep and damp for grain storage. Furthermore, all the chambers exhibited a symmetry uncharacteristic of utilitarian structures. This led to another hypothesis, that Longyou was not intended for human use at all. The cave's interiors resemble not dwellings, but rather structures, each chamber fulfilling a specific function within an overall system. Perhaps the builders were guided by knowledge lost long before the rise of the first Chinese dynasties. Perhaps they understood the geology, acoustics, and energetics of stone at a level that modern science is only just beginning to comprehend. It's no coincidence that all the caves are oriented identically, as if aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. Reports from the 1990s indicate that during measurements, compass instruments inside some chambers began to behave strangely. The needle would slowly deflect and then freeze, as if caught in the field of an invisible force. This effect was attributed to the natural magnetism of the rock, but nothing similar had been observed anywhere else in the region. This led to the idea that the complex's structure might be based on a principle that interacts with the planet's magnetic fields. Who then could have known about such things 2,000 years ago? Gradually, archaeologists began to examine the paradox from a different angle. Perhaps the vanished builders left no trace because that was their intention. The caves may have been sacred places where the very anonymity of the creator was considered the highest virtue. Ancient Chinese philosophy taught the path without a name, where creation was perceived as an act of merging with nature, not a personal achievement. Perhaps the builders of Longyou weren't seeking to leave a signature. On the contrary, they wanted their work to fade into silence, like the breath of the rock. But one detail remained that defied all rational explanations. Small depressions resembling niches were discovered on the walls of some caves. Their shape resembled the silhouettes of human figures, narrow, elongated, as if someone had stood with their back to the wall and vanished into the stone. Geologists called them natural depressions, but archaeologists weren't sure. The shape was too precise, and the placement too deliberate. Legends of Xianbei village quickly dubbed these niches the fingerprints of the creators. Today, when tourists descend into the Longyou caves, many pause at these walls and fall silent. Where voices and the clatter of tools should once have resounded, there is absolute silence. It's as if the place itself guards the secret of its creators. And the more time passes, the stronger the feeling that the builders have truly disappeared, not by death or escape, but simply by transcending the world in which humans live. The Longyou caves have become a monument not only to craftsmanship, but also to absence. They remind us that human history is not only the traces we leave behind, but also the shadows we erase. And perhaps the greatest builders are those we know nothing about. Light without fire. When archaeologists began to study the cave's interiors in detail, they noticed a strange feature that couldn't be explained by common sense. On the ceilings and walls, even in the deepest chambers, there were no traces of soot stains, or signs of burning. Not a single area indicated the use of torches, oil lamps, or any other light sources common in the ancient world. This discovery became one of Longyou's most astonishing mysteries. To carve such vast spaces, workers, had they existed, would have required constant light. Without illumination, it would have been impossible to maintain the precise lines and symmetry of the halls. But the caves are dominated by pure sandstone, light, smooth, without traces of soot. Even under a microscope, archaeologists found no carbon particles, which usually settle on ceilings where flames burn. And this is no coincidence. Similar purity was recorded in all 24 caves. This means the entire complex was built without fire, or with the aid of lighting, a phenomenon unknown to science. The archaeologists' first hypothesis was cautious. Perhaps the caves were built from the top down, allowing sunlight to penetrate until the chambers were completely sealed. But even if this were true, the depth of some chambers exceeds 30 meters. Not a single ray would have reached them. Others suggested that the builders used bronze or copper reflectors, directing light from the surface. However, experiments showed that even with a system of mirrors, the brightness would not have been sufficient to work at such a depth. Geologists then conducted another analysis. Microscopic traces of quartz, which can reflect and scatter light, were found on the walls. These crystals could have enhanced illumination at certain angles, creating a soft glow. Combined with the perfectly polished walls, this could have created the illusion of internal light, even with a minimal source. Perhaps the ancient masters were aware of these properties of the stone and consciously exploited them, transforming each room into a kind of reflective mirror. But there remained one detail that even the most skeptical researchers couldn't ignore. In some caves, barely noticeable traces of discoloration were observed on the ceilings, reminiscent of exposure to strong light or thermal radiation, not flame. they seem to emanate from the rock itself. When physicists from the Beijing Institute of Materials Science analyzed samples, they discovered a subtle change in the mineral structure, similar to a reaction following shortwave irradiation. No one could explain how such exposure could have occurred in ancient times. This sparked a new wave of theories. Some suggested that the builders used an unknown chemical method of illumination, perhaps special minerals capable of glowing when heated or rubbed. Indeed, in ancient China, stones were known to emit a soft glow when exposed to air, after being treated with lime and sulfur. But not a single sample of such substances has been found in the caves. The interior is perfectly clean, as if everything had been carefully washed and sealed. More daring researchers began to speculate about the possibility of electric light. While this sounded crazy, there were numerous factors supporting the idea. The absence of soot, the cleanliness of the walls, the nature of the reflection, and microcrystalline traces of melting. Some recalled archaeological finds in Baghdad, clay vessels with copper inserts that could have served as prototypes for batteries. And if similar technologies existed on the other side of Asia, it's possible that China too might have possessed a lost lighting system. However, official science categorically rejected any talk of electricity. Archaeologists limited themselves to the formulation, an unknown method of illumination. But even this sounded almost like an admission of defeat. After all, there are no other caves in the world where thousands of square meters of space could have been carved out in complete darkness and yet remain so pristine. When journalists first descended inside and pointed spotlights at the ceiling, the light reflected so softly that it seemed as if the stone itself was emitting a glow. Tourists visiting Longyou often report experiencing a strange sensation of light deep underground, a faint glow emanating from the walls. Scientists attribute this to reflection, but the effect is so persistent that it cannot be reproduced in the laboratory. Some esotericists believe that the builders of Longyou used the Earth's natural energy. The area where the complex is located does indeed lie at the intersection of several geological faults, creating a heightened electromagnetic field. Perhaps the ancient masters understood principles we are only just beginning to understand, and were able to channel these forces so that the stone itself became a conductor of light. Whatever the explanation, the fact remains. There was no fire in Longyou, no torches, no lamps, no smoke. Only endless silence and a light that seemed to emerge from the very depths of the stone. This paradox has become a symbol of the caves, proof that their creators knew more about nature than seems possible. And perhaps they understood something about light that modern man has long forgotten. The silence of water. Among the many mysteries of Longyou, one of the strangest and most difficult to explain is the water found in some of the caves. Despite the depth of the chambers and the absence of surface springs, the underground pools within the complex remain crystal clear still, and, according to researchers, virtually eternal. They are uncovered by any sediment, algae, or traces of organic decomposition. The water temperature remains stable year-round, and the level does not fluctuate even after heavy rains and droughts. This seems impossible if we assume the caves were carved out of ordinary rock, rather than designed with a complex hydraulic system in mind, which no one has yet been able to explain. The first pool was discovered in cave number 3, in the lowest chamber, reached by a narrow staircase with 47 steps. When archaeologists first descended, they expected to find stagnant groundwater, common at such depths, but instead of murky sediment, they found a mirror of crystal-clear liquid. The water was so clear that it seemed non-existent. At a depth of several meters, polished stone ledges could be seen descending in perfect geometry. The pool's level remained constant throughout the years of observation, even when surface wells dried up. Hydrologists from Hangzhou conducted measurements. The water contained no bacteria, mineral impurities, or traces of salts typical of underground rivers. It was so pure that its chemical composition resembled distilled water. And although there was no nearby spring that could feed these reservoirs, the water level remained constant, as if someone were artificially maintaining it. The only possible explanation was the presence of hidden channels, but these were not detected either visually or by radar. The engineers involved in the study hypothesized that the water could have come from underground capillaries running through the rock. However, calculations showed that the pressure in these layers was too low for a stable inflow. Another theory was then advanced, that the reservoirs were part of an ancient filtration system. Perhaps the builders deliberately created slopes and micropores through which the water slowly circulated, being purified as it passed through the quartz sandstone. This theory seemed plausible until an experiment with a dye was conducted. Scientists added a safe dye to one of the neighboring reservoirs and observed it for 3 months. The dye did not appear in any of the other reservoirs. This meant that each reservoir was isolated, meaning there was no filtration system. However, the very structure of the caves contradicts this. The water behaves like a living substance. It doesn't stagnate, doesn't become cloudy, and doesn't evaporate. A film never forms on the surface, even after decades. When one scientist attempted to collect water for analysis in an open vessel, within a few hours the liquid's properties changed. It became cloudy and lost its transparency. This led many to speculate that the underground environment is unique, as if the water only remains pure within these stone walls. Some researchers have compared the behavior of water to the phenomenon of a standing wave, a state where movement occurs but is not outwardly apparent. The Longyou caves are absolutely silent. Not even a drop of water falls from the ceiling. Perhaps the builders truly achieved a state of equilibrium, where the water does not move, yet still lives. Local residents have considered this water sacred since ancient times. Elders recounted how, in ancient times, women brought it to sick children, believing it relieved the breath of illness. Legend has it that anyone who drinks water from Longyou will forever cease dreaming, as if losing the ability to imagine. No one knows the origin of this legend, but archaeologists have repeatedly observed a strange sense of peace that occurs in anyone who spends more than a few hours underground. Some physicists have suggested that the water here is influenced by electromagnetic fields. Compasses do indeed behave strangely. The needle oscillates slightly, as if picking up an invisible pulse. Perhaps these fields create a stabilizing effect, preventing the water from reacting with external microorganisms. This phenomenon is known in laboratories, but is extremely rare in nature. However, for Chinese culture, where water symbolizes life and immortality, the very existence of eternal bodies of water has special meaning. In Taoist philosophy, water is the embodiment of the path, formless and omnipresent. And if the Longyou grottos are viewed as a temple, then these lakes could be not a random detail, but a sacred center, a reflection of the heavens beneath the earth. When tourists descend into these chambers today, guides warn them to keep their voices down. The pools have unusual acoustics. The sound of voices instantly fades, and it seems as if words dissolve into the water. Many describe a sensation of a strange presence, as if someone is listening from the depths. Perhaps it's just their imagination, but the water in Longyou is truly alive, silent, motionless, yet eternal. And, like the caves themselves, it preserves its secret without a single sound, a reminder that in the depths of the earth, even silence can be endless. Theories and guesses. More than 30 years have passed since the discovery of Longyou, but none of the theories about the origin of these caves has been convincingly confirmed. Archaeologists, geologists, historians, mystics, and even physicists have offered their own explanations, each seemingly logical until confronted with the facts. Longyou has become a kind of mirror of human thought, a place where every hypothesis crumbles against the granite silence of its walls. The first theory, proposed back in the 1990s, was the most obvious. Scientists hypothesized that the caves could have served as ancient grain storage facilities during the Qin dynasty. But this theory was quickly dismissed. In that case, the chambers would have had ventilation shafts and level floors, while Longyou features complex architecture with ledges, staircases, and decorative recesses. Furthermore, ancient Chinese chronicles contain no mention of large-scale construction of underground warehouses. The next hypothesis linked Longyou to stone quarrying. Builders were said to have quarried sandstone for temples and palaces, and the excavations themselves became caves. However, analysis showed that the rock at Longyou was not carved haphazardly. On the contrary, each chamber is symmetrical and complete. Quarries always leave traces of impacts, debris, and transport routes, but here the clarity and geometry are perfect. Some scholars have advanced a religious theory. They believe the caves may have been an underground temple built to worship the spirits of earth and water. This idea was supported by the acoustics of the chambers. Sound within them was amplified and attenuated, precisely as if the architecture were designed for rituals. However, not a single statue, inscription, or symbol has been found in Longyou. Chinese temples were always adorned with writing, prayers, names of patron saints, yin and yang symbols. Here, however, there is a complete absence of writing, as if the creators deliberately avoided words. More daring theorists speculated on scientific purposes. Perhaps Longyou was an ancient observatory or laboratory where sound, light, and water were observed. Considering that all the caves are oriented to the cardinal directions and maintain perfect angles, the idea seemed plausible. But the deeper the calculations went, the less conclusive it became. Even assuming the builders were skilled in astronomy, why build an underground complex for celestial observation? When conventional science ran out of arguments, independent researchers entered the scene. Among them were engineers, physicists, esotericists, and travelers, who saw in Longyou not just archaeology, but traces of lost knowledge. Some compared the caves to Baalbek in Lebanon and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, seeing common characteristics: a grandiose scale, incomprehensible precision, the absence of written sources, and a clear technological excess. All these monuments seem to have been created not for survival, but for memory, for an idea we can no longer decipher. There was another, far more mysterious hypothesis. In the early 2000s, a team of geophysicists from Beijing measured the magnetic field inside the caves and discovered strange deviations. In some chambers, the compass needle didn't stay in place, but slowly rotated, as if responding to hidden sources. This gave rise to the theory that Longyou could have been built at the intersection of Earth's energy lines, the very same dragon veins spoken of by ancient feng shui masters. If true, the complex could have acted as a giant conductor, balancing the flow of energy between Earth and sky. Local legends supported this idea. Elders recounted how, in ancient times, people of light went underground to listen to the Earth's breath and calm its wrath. They believed that Longyou was neither a prison nor a temple, but a bridge between worlds. This phrase was often repeated in regional folklore and, oddly enough, perfectly matched the actual impression of the caves. Those descending there for the first time say they feel the silence not as an absence of sound, but as a dense substance, as if the air were thicker. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that Longyou is not a human creation at all. The architecture, they argue, is too perfect for antiquity. Perhaps these are the remains of an unknown civilization that predated all known Asian cultures. There are even attempts to compare the layout of the caves with maps of star constellations. The shape of the complex does indeed resemble the outlines of Orion's belt, the very same belt along which the Egyptian pyramids were built. Is this a coincidence or a common theme passed down through the centuries? There is no answer. However, there is a more rational hypothesis. Some modern engineers suggest that the caves may have been part of an ancient hydraulic engineering project, perhaps a gigantic reservoir for regulating groundwater levels. The presence of reservoirs and traces of canals supports this theory. But even if we accept this theory, the question remains, why was it necessary to impart such beauty, harmony, and symmetry to an engineering system? No utilitarian structure is created with such meticulous care. Longyou stands on the border between logic and mysticism. Every attempt to explain its origins encounters the same emptiness that reigns within its halls. And perhaps this is no coincidence. Perhaps the secret of Longyou is that it was never intended to be explained. That this underground city was created not for utility, but for memory, to prove that even stone can hold thoughts. And as long as man continues to ask questions, these walls will remain silent. For their creators, whoever they were, accomplished the most important thing. They built not a place, but a mystery that has endured the ages. Science versus legends. By the early 2000s, Longyou had become a true symbol of the clash between science and myth. Archaeologists, armed with instruments, diagrams, and formulas, sought to provide a logical explanation for the phenomenon, while local residents, poets, and mystics saw the caves as a sacred place where heaven and earth met. Two realities, the rationale and the spiritual, existed in parallel, each attempting to prove that it was closer to the truth. Scientists arriving at Longyou from Beijing and Shanghai tried to maintain their composure. They claimed that everything here could be explained, they just lacked the necessary data. They were supported by officials, who demanded that reports mention only verified facts. However, everyone who descended returned with the same feeling, as if rational explanations had vanished with the light. The caves evoked in people not fear, but a strange sense of awe and bewilderment, as if confronted with something that should not have survived to this day. The initial debate centered on whether further excavations were worthwhile. Archaeologists understood that any intervention could disrupt the delicate balance of the microclimate. any air movement, an extra lamp, even the breathing of visitors would alter the humidity and temperature, and therefore the structure of the rock. Therefore, the Chinese authorities decided that most of the complex would remain closed. Of the 24 caves, only a few were opened, while the rest were sealed with metal partitions. This decision divided the scientific community. Some called it a sign of caution, others an act of fear of the unknown. Meanwhile, a legend grew around Longyou. Local monks spoke of ancient scrolls that supposedly mentioned a place underground where water sings. These texts were never found, but the myth lived on. Fortune tellers began appearing in villages, claiming that the caves breathed with the earth and responded to cosmic events. After every earthquake or solar eclipse, pilgrims came here to listen to the heart of the earth. And although archaeologists angrily denied such claims, instruments did indeed detect faint vibrations in the walls of the complex during strong seismic waves. Whether this was a coincidence or a natural phenomenon, no one knew. Meanwhile, researchers from Japan and Germany proposed a new hypothesis. They noted that the geometry of the chambers resembles modern resonance chambers used to study sound and vibrations. Perhaps Longyou was created as a gigantic acoustic instrument. When Japanese specialists conducted tests, they discovered that each cave had its own response frequency, and some resonated with each other. When the frequencies coincided, the air in the galleries began to vibrate slightly, creating the impression of breathing. Even skeptics couldn't ignore these findings, but instead of acknowledging the phenomenon, they preferred to dismiss it as a coincidence. And yet, the question persisted. Why did builders create spaces where sound behaves as if a planet-scale musical instrument were hidden underground? No utilitarian function required such precision. This brought to mind ancient texts about sounding stones, about the magic of resonance, which was given sacred significance even before the advent of writing. The scientific community was divided. Some saw Longyou as the laboratory of an ancient genius, others as a symbol of lost knowledge, and still others as simply an accident elevated to the rank of mystery. But the more research was conducted, the more contradictions arose. Radiocarbon dating failed. The dust in the caves proved too young to confirm antiquity, but the structure of the rock showed signs of aging stretching back thousands of years. Everything seemed illogical, as if the place itself were playing tricks on the researchers, changing its appearance to suit their expectations. The legends, on the contrary, grew ever more vivid. People spoke of lights appearing in some halls without a visible source, of strange sounds resembling the breath of wind, despite the absence of ventilation. Some claimed to have seen reflections on the walls, moving in the opposite direction of the lantern's light. Archaeologists dismissed these as fatigue and optical illusions, but these stories multiplied, and soon even the most pragmatic researchers acknowledged there was something in Longyou that science could not yet describe. The confrontation between science and myth is nothing new in Chinese culture. Confucius even said that knowledge without respect for mystery becomes empty. Perhaps this is why attitudes toward the Longyou gradually began to change. Scholars stopped looking for a direct answer and began to study the mystery itself. Concepts emerged linking the complex to the phenomenon of sacred spaces, places where a person senses the presence of something greater than themselves. Today, Longyou Temple remains half-closed, and the debate continues. For some, it is an ancient engineering marvel, for others, a temple of unknown power, and for still others, tangible proof that there is no boundary between legend and science, only a difference in language. And perhaps one day scientists armed with new methods will confirm what the elders of Xi'anbei have always said, that Longyou Temple was built not to be understood, but so that man could learn to listen to silence, a legacy that cannot be explained. Today, the Longyou grottos are protected by the state, but they remain a living symbol of the limitations of human knowledge. In the 30 years since their discovery, lighting has been installed, glass domes constructed, and safe trails for tourists paved. But even with modern technology, no researcher has been able to solve the main mystery: who, when, and why created this underground city. Every attempt to explain it becomes a circle, where the beginning and end coincide. Currently, only a few open chambers are accessible in Longyou. The entrance is decorated with stone railings, and inside, subdued spotlights gently glide along the walls, reflecting off the smooth surface and creating the sensation that the stone itself glows from within. The air here is still. The humidity is almost perfect, and the temperature remains constant year-round, around 16 degrees Celsius. All this makes the underground experience strangely comfortable. Tourists walk in silence, hearing only their own footsteps, which quickly disappear into the depths. Even sounds behave differently here. They don't bounce off the walls, but seem to be absorbed, dissolving into the stone. Many note that the longer you spend in the caves, the more you feel as if time ceases to exist. The light softens, your breathing slows, your thoughts become still. It's as if Longyou was created not to impress, but to soothe. Some see this as an architectural effect, others as a trace of spiritual design. But the fact remains, even after millennia, the place retains the same energy as the day it was discovered. Scientists continue their research. In recent years, laser scanners and 3D modeling equipment have been brought to Longyou to create a virtual map of the complex. When the project was completed, it was discovered that the caves form a symmetrical pattern reminiscent of the ancient character Ren, meaning human. This discovery sparked renewed debate. Some claimed it was a mere coincidence, while others believed it contained a message. Human beings are part of stone, and stone is part of human beings. But beyond science, Longyou has become something more. For the people of China, it has become a symbol of remembrance and humility. Light festivals are held here, where hundreds of lamps glow inside the caves, reflecting in underground pools. People come not only to watch, but also to listen, for there is something ancient, almost human in this silence. Some sit against the walls and simply sit, as if hoping to hear an answer that cannot be expressed in words. International expeditions continue to arrive, but the question who built it is increasingly less frequently asked. More and more often it's, why is it still standing? After all, the caves have survived earthquakes, floods, and erosion, and remain as they were thousands of years ago. Perhaps because they were built not for glory, but for eternity. Or because their creators understood the material better than we understand our own technology. Some historians say the Longyou is a message encoded not in words but in form. Every line, every curve of the walls, every drop of water conveys the idea of harmony between man and the earth. Perhaps the builders were trying to remind those who come after that all greatness is created in silence. Today, the Longyou Temple is called the eighth wonder of China. But for those who have seen it with their own eyes, it's more than just a monument. It's a living book, written on stone in a language we can't yet read. Perhaps science will one day explain everything, but, as local monks say, if that day comes, the mystery will cease to breathe. Therefore, it's best to let the Longyou Temple remain what it always was. A reminder that not everything in this world is meant to be understood. Some things exist simply so that, when one looks at them, one can experience the reverent silence in which knowledge begins.